All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the 7th week together. So we're pretty much at the halfway point. We'll have another week, of course, next week. And then after that, we're going to have our spring break. So we'll have a week off. That'll be an opportunity for all of you to catch up, for you to get ahead, for you to stabilize if things aren't going too steady. Ultimately, it is simply an opportunity. Don't see it as a chance to just like slack off for a week. It is, but you shouldn't see it that way because you're going to have 3 months of that once the semester ends. And so, like, you're still in school. You should have some fun, go out with your friends, whatever. But definitely, like, you're going to have a lot of extra time, and like that extra time should be spent working on the stuff that you've committed yourself to. End of story. Like, you want this to turn out well, make it turn out well. Turn it around for yourself, or enhance it, or keep it going at the level that it's already at. Whatever it is that you have to do with respect to like your standing in this course and your other courses, like seriously reflect on that and figure out, well, what can I do during this opportunity to like make the best of it. So make sure that you do that. As far as this class goes, we're going to cover the end of chapter 5 today. We have just like one small topic to cover. And then we're going to cover 2 chapters. We're going to cover chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6, not a big chapter. And chapter 7 is not a big chapter either. So they'll both be covered today. And then we'll start covering the next chapter next week. Go on spring break after that, come back, and we'll meet. And then the next week there'll be another exam. So we're already at that point in the semester where it's kind of like the domino effect. One thing leads to the next, and ultimately it is all about getting to that finish line. So just always expect more. There's always more around the corner. It's never a time to kind of just like sit back and be like, all right, I made it through that crazy week. No, like there's crazy weeks still coming. And they're not going to stop coming until the end. That's what you've signed up for. So you should see it as what it is and like commit yourself to it in the way you need to. So as far as like chapter 5 goes, which will be the first chapter we finish today, I'll set up a mini paper for that, and the homework has already been opened, I think. But if it's not, I'll open it. Yeah, I opened it a while back. So for the mini paper for that will be due next week. For 6 and 7, I'll have due at the end of the spring break. So you'll have that opportunity to write some mini papers if you're a little bit behind and kind of want to just knock a few out during the break. If you've already done 1, you just have to do the 2. If you want to do those 2 and jump back to another chapter, there's the open chapter mini paper submission. So essentially you have the opportunity during the break to knock out the entire paper if you haven't even started on it yet, because it's a good idea to do so. You write it now, towards the end of the semester, finals, other class assignments piling up, you're not going to have to deal with the paper for this class. It's going to be done already, and you're going to feel good about that. And you could just take a moment and then just kind of clean it up, turn it in, get a good grade for it, and done. So this is definitely the right time to do it. The reason why I'm doing that for chapter 6 and 7 is because they are less abstract. Like there's not a lot of like weird kind of like models that like create important intuitions for you, for managers, for business in general, all based on economic models, and the complexity there is necessary. But obviously, if you're not as plugged into the course as you should be to really truly grasp those concepts, then it's a little bit more difficult to write mini papers based on chapters that focus on those models. So these couple of chapters don't focus on models. There's a little bit of something in the chapter 6 that deals with marginal cost and benefit of writing contracts, but beyond that, it's pretty practical info. So you could certainly find ways of sort of applying the concepts to your case that you've chosen, to explain aspects of it, to maybe analyze it, to maybe lay out a path forward for the firm, whatever approach you're taking to writing this paper. Like there's some good opportunities in those 2 chapters to kind of just like apply some practical information to to the cases, and that's it. Just write some decent papers and get that done. So again, I will provide you that opportunity. So make sure you take it and just get the paper out of the way. Again, this is not something that I require for the course. I wouldn't structure the course with a paper. It's a university requirement for people at your level, and ultimately it's a good thing because like writing is one of the most important skills that you can develop. Period. Like regardless of what industry you wind up going into, if you are clearly able to put together like an argument and clearly communicate everything all the points that you're trying to make, then that's gold. That is gold. And so you shouldn't turn away from it. You shouldn't be afraid of it. You should embrace it. It's an opportunity for you to fine tune your writing skills, and that again, like it's so important. It's probably one of the most important things that you can learn at this place. So take it seriously. Like, don't just like write it overnight and just write some crap that I'm going to wind up having to read. Like, write something that's going to be worthwhile, something that you can be proud of, something that like will get you a good grade. Ultimately, because it is about grades and to some extent in this class, of course. But if you're not doing anything else but writing a good paper in this class, that's not going to get you through. So don't depend on the paper. You also need to learn the material we're covering. You need to do well on the exam, so make sure that you're doing that as well if you're looking to get something out of this class. All right, so I'm going to jump into the material unless somebody has something that you would like me to address before I get started. All right, then let's jump in. So again, Chapter 5 dealt with production and cost. We laid out the basic model of production in order to then be able to translate that to costs that the firms face that are going to be most relevant when we're analyzing optimal firm decisions in a variety of market contexts that range with respect to how competitive they are, from as competitive as possible, perfectly competitive markets, to the least competitive possible, the monopoly. In order to figure out like how should they price, how much output should firms produce, how are all these things going to affect their revenues, ultimately their profits. Like we need a framework of costs to be able to compare the costs to the benefits of doing business, which is revenues, and then that's sort of what gets us to those insights that are important for managers. And so that's what this chapter has been about: setting up production, setting up costs. I'll quickly just go over the second half of the stuff we covered last week with respect to long run costs, and just touch upon the last topic, which was the multiple output cost function. Cost functions that represent a firm that is selling multiple products, not just like one type of product. In that case, there's a couple of benefits the firm can enjoy from that kind of approach that has to do with savings on production. So producing things together is generally going to be cheaper than producing them apart. That's what's called economies of scope. And there's also a thing called cost complementarities, where if you produce things together, then the extra cost of producing additional units goes down, and we can capture those properties within the cost function. So I'll just generally establish a cost function for multi-products, and then just kind of point out the properties that reflect either cost complementarities or economies of scope. And then we'll cover Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 has to do with the organization of the firm, just kind of dealing with some practical issues that focus on the roles that managers play in the production process that then allows the firm to be able to depend on the insights that we establish in the production and cost chapter. The two main tasks of the manager are to make sure that employees are working on the production function, and then the other one is that they are choosing the right input mix to minimize costs, meaning they're choosing the right amount of capital, right amount of labor, other inputs to minimize their costs. So we'll just talk about some of the issues related to procuring inputs, like when you're actually in a firm, like what are some of the obstacles that you may encounter in trying to get the inputs you need at the lowest cost possible, and what are the different options that you might take given certain obstacles that you might face. So I'll lightly touch upon that, and then the other big topic is dealing with what's called the principal agent problem. Sort of how do you align the interests of those in charge to those working, and so it's all about like incentive structures, very simple stuff. As far as like the approach we take here, it'll be a very simple approach to sort of just highlighting a couple of like guiding principles for those things. But those are the kind of things that are dealt with more in your other management courses. If you are a management major, like there's, I'm sure there's a wide range of classes that deal with these topics. So not too much stuff covered in chapter 6. Therefore, chapter 6, fairly short chapter. We'll be done with it by the break. And then we'll come back and we'll cover all of chapter 7. And chapter 7 has to do with like pointing out the aspects of industries that will make them more or less competitive than other industries. So we'll look at structure. How are the different industries structured as far as like, are there big leaders? Are there a lot of large firms? Are there a lot of small firms? So we'll talk about some of those issues. Conduct. How are the firms behaving as far as like their merger activity? How are they behaving as far as their pricing activities? Like we'll just talk about some issues there. There's some measures that we use to kind of gauge these things. And then finally, performance. Like how do firms like perform as far as their profits go in these differing kind of market settings. And it's all about kind of laying the groundwork for then using the framework that we learned in chapter 5 to start analyzing the optimal decisions of firms in these different market settings. And so chapter 7 is kind of about providing you the insights of why there are different market settings and why they differ dramatically, and then why ultimately there's a need to think about how a manager should approach those situations differently in order to optimize profits, which is what it's all about. Because it is, of course, how we value firms. We value it based on the present discounted value of their net profits, and so that's what we do here. That's what it's all about, getting you to that point where you kind of have that intuition that you need to understand like the baseline case, so that when you go out into the world and you do end up managing, if that's the track that you're on, you kind of have these basic insights available to you to compare them against what you're actually dealing with in the world, and kind of, provide you a foundational sort of set of principles that can help guide you to, make the right decisions in the more complex setting that is the real world. So there's a lot of value in this course, folks. It's not just a bunch of like equations and like technical stuff that you'll never use again. Like everything that you're being taught in this class and your other classes has practical value. And even if you don't learn it all backwards and forwards now, as long as you understand it now, you can reference it later and like just remember, oh yeah, there were these theories or ideas that can maybe help me maneuver my way through this particular situation that I find myself in, either running a business or being part of a large firm, or who knows, whatever it is that you wind up doing. All right, any questions that popped up before I jump into the actual material that we're going to cover? Alrighty, let's go. So previously in Econ 308, we talked about the long run versus the short run, how in the short run, there's at least one factor of production that is fixed, and so the firm has to deal with that. And then we developed that condition that allowed us to sort of understand like how a firm optimally chooses the inputs into production to maximize profits in the short run, which was to set the value of the marginal product of the input equal to the price of that input. So we had the value of the marginal product being the value of the extra output an additional unit of an input can produce, which is their marginal product, the extra amount of output they can produce by being employed in increasing units, times the amount that can be sold at the price. So that's the value of the marginal product. set equal to the cost. So if we're talking about labor, the value of the marginal product of labor set equal to the wage in order to figure out what the optimal amount of labor is. And the value of the marginal product of capital is set equal to the rental rate, which is the price of capital, in order to figure out what's the optimal amount of capital to choose in the short run. In the long run, when everything is variable, the firm can choose both inputs, and there's varying amounts of inputs that can produce a certain amount of output. And so we looked at this framework, the ISO quant and ISO cost framework, which was very similar to the indifference curve budget constraint framework, but applied from the perspective of the firm. So instead of an individual trying to maximize their satisfaction by choosing a consumption bundle of two goods that will be within their budget and give them the highest amount of satisfaction possible, we established a similar framework where the firm is maybe targeting a certain amount of output. So in this case, this ISO quant, same quantity, ISO quant curve, ISO same quant quantity, corresponds to producing 100 units of output. And that 100 units of output can be produced with a lot of capital, a little bit of labor, or a little bit of capital and a lot of labor. So here would be labor intensive, there's capital intensive, or it could be somewhere in between. And so the challenge of the firm is to figure out, well, how much capital, how much labor should I use in order to produce 100 units of output at the lowest cost possible? And so we interacted these ISO cost lines with these ISO quant curves with the ISO cost lines that represent utilizing the different levels of the inputs in order to yield the same cost. So you could have like a lot of capital, a little bit of labor, and it'll cost you the same as like a lot of labor and a little bit of capital. At this point here, these lines, as we get further into the origin, represent lower costs. As we get farther away, they represent higher costs. And so if you looked at this point here, this represents the firm producing 100 units at a cost of C1, which is higher than C2, using a lot of capital and a little bit of labor. But they could produce 100 units at this point here that will meet this cost, which will be the minimum cost to produce that amount, and use less capital and a little bit more labor. So this is the optimal input mix that they need to minimize their cost of producing 100 units of output. It happens at the point where the ISO cost line is tangent, just touching the ISO quant line curve, which is at this point here. So at the point where that happens, where the firm is minimizing its costs, the slopes of those two curves are equivalent. We established that the slope of the ISO quant line is called the marginal rate of technical substitution. It's the rate at which the firm can trade out one input for another in order to maintain the level of output constant. And we established that that slope, the marginal rate of technical substitution, is equivalently expressed as the ratio of the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. So the marginal product of the input on the x-axis, the marginal product of the input on the y-axis. And the slope of the ISO cost line is equal to the ratio of the price of the input on the x-axis to the price of the input on the y-axis. So at the optimal input mix, the cost minimizing input mix to produce 100 units of output, the slopes are equal, therefore these expressions are equal, and we can move them around. We can get marginal product of capital on the right hand side, multiplying both sides of marginal product of capital, and then divide both sides by the wage rate to get this expression here that tells us that the cost minimizing condition for the firm in the long run is to choose their inputs such that the extra amount of output per unit used of each input is going to cost the same. So each additional dollar spent on the inputs at this point is going to yield the same amount of output. So the marginal product per dollar spent across all inputs is equivalent. So if they spend $1 on labor at that point, then it's going to yield the same amount of output as if they spent $1 on capital at that point. And any other point, you're not going to get that. You're going to get Over here, we're going to have the marginal product of labor per dollar spent is going to be greater than capital, and so the firm's going to want to use more labor and less capital, so they're going to move along the ISO quant curve to this point. And over here, the marginal product of capital per dollar spent is going to be less than that of labor, and therefore the firm's going to want to use less labor and more capital, and so then they would move back to that point. So it's an equilibrium point, it's a stable point, it's the cost minimizing point for the firm that, again, is targeting a certain level of output and wants to minimize their costs. In order to do that, they choose capital and labor such that the marginal products to their prices are equivalent across all inputs. So this is the condition for the long run, just like the value of the marginal product of the input equal to the price was the condition in the short run to choose the optimal input amount to minimize costs. So that's ultimately what's most important here, like knowing this condition, understanding what it means, and just basically being able to work with it. And then we talked about the cost function that came from our production function. And because there is, again, a short run and a long run, there's going to be a short run cost function, a long run cost function. The short run cost function is going to reflect the fact that there's a fixed input, and therefore that fixed input is going to have a fixed cost. And so total costs in the short run are going to be equal to both fixed costs and variable costs. Variable cost being the cost of the variable input, which we assume to be labor in this class. So this is the short run cost function. The derivative of the cost function of the total cost function is the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing an additional unit. Other important costs are the average costs. So we've got the average fixed cost, which was fixed cost divided by quantity. This amount in the short run, if the firm, again, is not changing their level of capital, this will always be getting smaller and smaller as the firm increases the scale of its operation, meaning they're producing the larger amounts. So average fixed cost is always going to be decreasing, which we say it's spreading. So there's a spreading effect from the increase of scale due to the average fixed cost. Then there's the average variable cost, which is the variable cost, the cost of labor divided by the amount of output. And that's going to go down and then go up. And it depends on the fact that we have those decreasing returns to scale, and initially we have increasing returns to scale and then decreasing returns to scale in production. I'll mention it one more time in a second when we look at the graphs and explain what that is once again. And then, of course, we have average total cost, the average amount of producing a certain level of output, and that's going to be equal to the sum of our average fixed cost plus our average variable cost. And here we have basically the relationship between marginal cost, average total cost, average variable cost. The distance between our average total cost curve and our average variable cost curve is the average fixed cost. As the firm produces more, that distance gets smaller and smaller because of that spreading effect. Marginal cost initially is going down, and that's because of that assumption we made about the production process, where in general, we imagine a firm that's like hiring, the first person, the second, the third, the first few individuals that are dividing up the tasks that the firm needs to do, doing the books, maintaining the machines, producing. There's increasing returns due to specialization initially in all production processes. So that means that the marginal product of the input, which is labor generally, is going to be increasing. There's going to be increasing returns initially when the first few people are hired. That's going to cause the extra cost of producing additional units to go down. When this changes is the point where the firm hits that short-run wall, where the amount of capital that's fixed, the factory space, the amount of machinery the firm has, etc., starts to become limited. The only way they can increase their output is by hiring more people, so they do, because they want to produce more, but those people are limited by the amount of capital they have, so they start to get in each other's way because there's not enough factory space around. They start to not being able to produce as efficiently because they have to share machines, etc. So because of that, marginal cost starts to increase due to the diminishing returns to labor. And that's when the marginal product of labor starts to decrease, meaning that each additional person hired produces less than the last person hired. So marginal product starts to diminish, which starts to bring up the marginal cost. Our variable costs are going to be decreasing at first due to increasing returns from specialization from hiring those first few people. That's bringing down the average variable cost. But once diminishing returns set in, that's going to start to bring up marginal cost. Average variable cost is basically the average at any given level of output of the labor costs. And even though you get that diminishing returns effect that starts to bring up marginal costs here, it's still below the extra cost of producing additional units is still below the average variable cost. And so it will continue to bring down the average variable cost even after diminishing returns starts to bring up marginal cost. But at the point where they cross, that's the point at which the diminishing return starts to pull up average variable cost. And so average variable costs then start to increase. So you're going to get that U-shaped variable cost curve, average variable cost curve, that's going to have its minimum at the point where marginal cost crosses it, where it is equal to marginal cost. Here's our average total cost curve. Again, it is a sum of average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. There's two forces acting on that. One is the average variable cost. So as average variable cost is going down, that's pulling down average total cost. But the other component, the average fixed cost, is also pulling it down because of the spreading effect. As the firm gets bigger, average fixed cost gets smaller, meaning that the cost of producing additional units attributable to the fixed cost of the fixed input capital is smaller and smaller as the firm produces more and more. So both of those forces are bringing down the average total cost curve initially. Once marginal cost crosses average variable cost, starts to pull it up due to diminishing returns. That starts to have that countervailing effect on average total cost, wanting to pull it up. But over this range here, past the minimum of the U-shaped average variable cost curve, where average total cost is still going down, the dominant effect acting on it is still going to be the spreading effect of those fixed costs being spread out, the average fixed cost pulling it down. But at the point where marginal cost crosses the average total cost, that's the point at which the diminishing returns becomes the dominant effect, and because the average variable cost curve starts to pull it up in a very dramatic way, the spreading effect of average fixed costs becomes basically impotent, and the average total cost starts to increase. And that happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it. So once again, the minimum of the average total cost will happen at the point where marginal cost crosses it, where marginal cost is equal to average total cost. So these curves, as we see them here, are going to be relevant when we're talking about the decisions that firms are making as far as like their what kind of profits they're making, why they're choosing to produce a certain amount versus another, what prices they're choosing to charge in a particular market. So understand this relationship, basically. It's a really important one, and really if you understand it, then you have a lot of like the basic intuition you need to really understand how most businesses operate. All right, then we looked at the algebraic form of the cost functions. The best cost function that will capture these general properties that I just talked about is the cubic cost function. So it's going to have some fixed cost, which is going to be a term that's not going to have the Q variable associated. So that cost is not changing. It's the fixed cost. And then the terms that do have the Q associated with it are going to be the variable cost. So these three terms are the variable cost, and this F is the fixed cost. And of course, our marginal cost, the cost of producing additional units, which was that swoosh-shaped curve here that goes down then up. We can figure out the equation for that marginal cost as we're increasing our output by taking the derivative of the cost function. So make sure you're able to do that. All right, then we talked about long-run costs. So in the long run, the firm is able to adjust their level of capital, and each time they do, they wind up in a new short-run average total cost curve. So initially, the firm's on this average total cost curve, and they've spent a certain amount of capital. They produced, let's say, Q naught units. Things are going well. So they're like, oh, let's increase our output. So they do. And the only way to increase their output is by increasing their average total cost because, as we know, diminishing returns will dominate and cause average total cost to increase eventually. And therefore, the average cost of producing more output will go up. So the firm is like, well, now it's kind of eroding my profit, so I need to buy more capital. So they do. They buy a hell of a lot more capital, and they wind up on this huge average total cost curve. Once they've gotten the new capital, they're once again in a new short-run situation. At that old level of output, they've minimized their cost, but now they want to produce more, so they do. But due to the diminishing returns, of, again, the variable input, their average total cost is driven up once again. So once again, they realize we need to get more capital. So they do eventually when they're able to. And they wind up in this new average total cost curve. So that same level of output is once again minimized to be Q2. But we see that the long-run average cost, which defines the minimum average cost of producing alternative levels of output, allowing for optimal selection of all variables of production, which is this red curve that's kind of touching like the minimums on all those average total cost short-run curves. Even that curve eventually gets pulled up. And so there's only a range over which firms can enjoy decreasing their average cost of production, even in the long run. Even in the long run, ultimately, their cost of producing will increase in most industries. So we talked about how, like, in the decreasing end of the average total cost curve, we have what's called economies of scale, or also known as decreasing returns. Also known as increasing returns to scale. Meaning that as they get bigger, the average cost of producing gets less. And so it makes sense for them to be large. And in industries that have economies of scale, you're going to find a lot of large firms because that's the best way to operate in those industries. You minimize your cost of producing by being big. If you don't do that, you can't compete with the ones that do because their costs are going to be less than yours. And so in those industries, size becomes what's called a barrier to entry. It stops other firms from getting in because they need to invest a lot in order to be of that size necessary to be able to compete. And so industries that exhibit economies of scale will tend to be oligopolies with large firms dominating, but not a lot of them, maybe like, I don't know, a few. 8 is usually the most, 8 to 10. Then there's other possibilities for long-run average cost. You might have a long-run average cost curve that is just constant and actually doesn't exhibit that pattern, and it's just going to be specific to a particular type of industry. In this type of industry, you have what's called constant returns to scale. In constant returns to scale industries, size is not a big factor. So there's no size advantage. You can be small, you can be big. It doesn't really make a big difference as far as your overall costs go. And so a lot of firms can compete regardless of their size. But then there might be industries that are characterized by diseconomies of scale, meaning that it just doesn't make sense for firms to get big because then they'll have what's called decreasing returns to scale, which is another way of saying diseconomies of scale, which means that average total cost will go up if they try to get bigger. And so industries that exhibit that characteristic will tend to have a lot more small firms because getting big doesn't make sense because then costs go up. And so you'll see a lot more competition in industries that have diseconomies of scale. So the nature of long-run costs has a lot to do with like the nature of the industry itself, like how competitive an industry will be has everything to do with the structure of their long-run average costs, whether they have economies of scale, constant returns to scale, or diseconomies of scale. All right, let's jump into the end of chapter 5. Multiple output cost functions. So analysis for the case of a firm that produces single output also applies to a multi-product firm, but additional issues must be addressed. So we assume the cost function for a multi-product firm is given by just this general expression where cost is a function of two different types of output. Imagine a firm that produces both trucks and cars, let's say. where Q1 is the number of units produced of product 1, let's say cars, and Q2 is the number of units produced of product 2, let's say trucks. The multi-product cost function defines the cost of producing Q1 units of product 1 and Q2 units of product 2, assuming all inputs are used efficiently, meaning we're assuming that the firms are cost minimizing. They are choosing those level of inputs that are going to be at that point of tangency between their ISO quant and their ISO cost curves. The cost of production depend on how much of each type of output is going to be produced. This gives rise to what economists call economies of scope and cost complementarities. Economies of scope exist when the total cost of producing Q1 and Q2 together is going to be less than the total cost of producing them separately. So we can exhibit that same sort of relationship with this kind of notation, where again the cost of producing output 1 plus the cost of producing output 2 separately is going to be greater than producing them together. In a restaurant, to produce given quantities of steak and chicken dinners, it generally is cheaper to produce both products in the same restaurant. So that's a very simple case of economies of scope. Cost complementarities exist in a multi-product cost function when the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units of one output, is reduced when the output of another product is increased. So if we let C of Q1, Q2 be the cost function for the multi-product firm, and we let MC1 be the marginal cost of producing output 1, which let's say is cars, the cost function exhibits cost complementarity if the marginal cost of producing output 1 with respect to a change in output 2 is negative, meaning that the extra cost of producing a car goes down when you produce more trucks. That's what this is saying, if we're talking about that example. So an example of cost complementarity is the production of donuts and donut holes. It's a very simple example, but it does make a lot of sense. The extra cost of producing additional donut holes goes down when you produce more donuts, because you just take that piece of dough out of the middle and you got yourself a donut hole. Marginal cost of producing donut holes goes down when you produce more donuts. Cost complementarity. The concepts of economies of scope and cost complementarity can also be examined within the context of an algebraic functional form for a multi-product cost function. Suppose the multi-product cost function is quadratic. So this is essentially the same cost function we were looking at before, but we're throwing in additional terms to represent the different amounts of output. So we've got, of course, a fixed cost to producing, which is standard. You've got this term here, which represents the variable cost of producing both of these outputs together. So maybe like the cost of labor that, is, if we're talking about trucks and cars, that put the wheels on the cars. So that's the same, regardless of whether it's a car or a truck, they deal with wheels, whatever. The variable cost of producing just the car, whatever, putting the shell of the car on versus the variable cost of producing output 2, the truck, putting the shell of the truck on, which is different than putting the shell of the car on. So you would need to account for different labor costs in those different processes, because they probably would cost differently. So for this cost function, the marginal cost is the derivative of this with respect to, is the partial derivative. The marginal cost of producing output 1, which we're assuming, let's say, is cars, is a partial derivative of our multi-product cost function with respect to Q1. So the derivative of a fixed number is equal to 0. The derivative of this with respect to Q1, if you're taking a partial, because there's two variables in it, you assume the other variable is just a constant. So you treat it like a constant. So essentially, you have Q1 there, raised to the first power, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from that. You're left with Q1 raised to the 0 power, which is equal to 1. So the derivative of this with respect to Q1 is equal to AQ2. And then the only other term that has Q1 in it is this one. So you take the derivative of this with respect to Q1 to Q1, subtract 1 from the exponent, so you're left with that term there. And then this term, because Q1's not in it, we consider it a constant, so it's treated like the fixed cost, and the derivative of a constant is equal to 0, so that drops out. So the marginal cost of producing output 1 is equal to AQ2 plus 2Q1, and we see that the extra cost of producing output 1 is dependent partly on how much output 2 is produced. When that coefficient there is negative, it's less than 0, an increase in Q2 will reduce the marginal cost of producing product 1. And therefore, if A is negative, then this multi-product cost function will exhibit cost complementarities. All right, so that's the formula for the multi-product cost function. The multi-product cost function looks like this and has corresponding marginal cost functions. This one that we just looked at, and then just taking the partial derivative of this with respect to Q2 will get us a marginal cost of producing output 2. So we do that similarly. It's basically just switching the subscripts there. Don't worry, I won't need you to take these derivatives. To examine whether economies of scope exist for a quadratic multi-product cost function, recall that there are economies of scope if, again, producing the outputs independently is going to cost more than producing them together. So remember this expression here. We can subtract this term from both sides, and we can get, therefore, this expression here that will be equivalent to that one. If we plug in our cost functions for these terms, don't worry, I won't ask you to derive this. Ultimately, I'm just going to need a couple of properties that you should be able to identify to either identify if a multi-product cost function has cost complementarities or economies of scope, which I'll cover in a second. But I need to derive this in order to show you why that's true. Anyway, so here's the cost of producing output 1. It's going to be some fixed cost plus some variable cost. The cost of producing output 2, some fixed cost plus some variable cost. And then the cost of producing them together is our multi-product cost function. We're subtracting that, so that's why it's being subtracted. So we're subtracting f, so these f's drop out. We're subtracting q1 squared, so that drops out and that drops out. We're subtracting q2 squared, so this drops out and that drops out. So all we're left with is f minus a q1 q2 greater than 0. If we add this term to both sides, then essentially this is telling us that the multi-product cost function exhibits economies of scope if the fixed cost is greater than that variable cost of producing the goods together. So economies of scope are realized in producing output levels Q1 and Q2 if, again, F is greater than that interactive term representing the variable cost of producing the goods together. So summary of the properties of the quadratic multi-product cost function. The multi-product cost function that we see here exhibits cost complementarities if A is less than 0 and exhibits economies of scope if F is greater than this term here. Make sure you understand this and what cost complementarity and economies of scope are essentially. All right, let's do a quick demonstration problem. Suppose the cost function of firm A, which produces 2 goods, is given by this multi-product cost function here. The firm wishes to produce 5 units of good 1 and 4 units of good 2. The first question the problem asks is, do cost complementarities exist and do economies of scope exist? And then the second question is, firm A is considering selling the subsidiary that produces good 2 to firm B, in which case it will only produce good 1. What will happen to firm A's cost if it continues to produce 5 units of good 1? So essentially, if the firm exhibits economies of scope, then the cost of producing each of them together should be higher than producing them. Producing them separately should be higher than producing them together. And so we need to examine like that, if that's indeed happening. But first, for part 1, are there cost complementarities here? There are, right? Because the coefficient on this interactive term is negative. And therefore, there are cost complementarities in this multi-product cost function representing that multi-product production process. Now let's see if there are economies of scope when producing 5 units of good 1 and 4 units of good 2. Are there? So this is 20 times 0.5, which is 10. And that's going to be 100 is greater than that, right? but also you have a negative there, so therefore it's going to be negative. So if there are cost complementarities, then you are going to have economies of scope. So yeah, F is greater than A Q1 Q2, and therefore this production process does exhibit economies of scope as well. All right, to determine what will happen to firm A's cost if it sells a subsidiary that produces good 2 to firm B, we have to calculate costs under the alternative scenarios. So notice that the total cost to firm A of producing 5 units of good 1 will fall from, so if we consider how much their costs are to produce them together, that's going to be $131, let's say. Maybe it's millions, it's probably millions. 2, if they just produce it by itself, therefore they only need to incur the fixed cost and the variable cost of producing that output 1. So 100 times 5 squared is equal to $125. So they sell off their subsidiary and they do reduce their cost, but really not by much. The cost of producing, the cost to firm B now, who has bought the production means to produce output 2, which we could say is trucks, let's say. The cost to them is going to be, again, 100 plus Q2 squared, so it's going to be 100 plus 16, so it's going to be 116 bucks. So we can see that indeed this firm did enjoy economies of scope. Their cost of producing them together was 131, but apart, we're looking at what, $241. So firm A's cost will fall by only $6 when it stops producing good 2, and the cost to firm B of producing 4 units of good 2 will be $116. The combined cost of the 2 firms of producing the output originally produced by a single firm will be $110 more than the cost of producing by a single firm. So the preceding problem illustrates some important aspects of mergers and sales of subsidiaries. First, when there are economies of scope, 2 firms producing distinct outputs could merge into a single firm and enjoy a reduction in costs. Second, selling off an unprofitable subsidiary could lead only to minor cost reductions. All right, so that's the multi-output cost function. In effect, when economies of scope exist, it is difficult to allocate costs across product lines, meaning that it's better to combine the product lines rather than try to separate the variable and fixed costs into different outputs. All right, let's jump into chapter 6, which again is not very long, so we will not be spending too much time on it. So again, as a manager, you're interested in procuring the inputs you need in order to produce. There's different ways that you might go about doing that. So a manager can use several approaches to obtain the inputs needed to produce a product. One is that you pay the market price for the good or service in the open market. You just go out and find what you need by the vendors that are available to sell them to you. Pay them, get what you need, you're done. The second is to sign a contract with a firm that provides the good or service and pay the price negotiated in the contract. So under that situation, you form a long-term relationship with an input supplier. The price is fixed. The terms are fixed, for however the length of the contract is. So there's not much flexibility there. And also there's a lot of costs involved in setting up the contract, getting it written out, making sure it covers all contingencies, which can be expensive because lawyers are very expensive. And then finally, the third option is just simply to create a division within the firm and basically incorporate that production process into the firm itself. So each option will imply different cost functions for the manager. The manager's job is to choose the method that minimizes costs. So let's consider them in turn. The first option is to purchase the inputs using what's called a spot exchange. A spot exchange occurs when the buyer and seller of an input meet, exchange, and then go about their separate ways. The parties may make an exchange without even knowing each other's names, and there is no formal legal relationship between the buyer and the seller. A key advantage is that the firm gets to specialize in doing what it does best, converting inputs into outputs. So it doesn't have to deal with, producing the good itself, and therefore kind of splitting its focus from what it's meant to be good at. Also, a lot of complications that may be encountered by like trying to basically incorporate like a whole new division into the firm is avoided. Um, but ultimately, like there's certain conditions that need to be in place in order for that to work out. Like the good needs to be standardized. Like it needs to be something that's readily available. A lot of suppliers make it. It's a very competitive market for the input that's being purchased. So no individual buyer, no individual seller can have any kind of leverage over the manager and like try to hike up prices, etc. So it has to be a very like easy transaction. We'll talk about the costs that could pop up in a second with respect to this kind of situation. So again, a spot exchange is often used when inputs are standardized. Second option, acquire inputs under a contract. A contract, as you know, is a legal document that creates an extended relationship between a particular buyer and seller of an input. It specifies the terms under which they agree to exchange over a given time horizon. It can be difficult and costly to write a complete contract. Acquiring inputs with contracts does allow a firm to specialize in what it does best, though. So it does avoid the need to what's called vertically integrate and incorporate one portion of the supply chain into its own operations. But we'll talk about like the issues related to the contract and the contract length in a bit. This also allows a firm to purchase non-standard inputs for which there may not be many suppliers. So again, when the input is something very specific that cannot be found, and it's really easy to kind of fall prey to like the input supplier because they can kind of hold you hostage because they know you need the input. Then under that situation, a contract will usually be a better option. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then finally, produce the inputs internally, which means to vertically integrate. When a firm shuns other suppliers and chooses to produce an input internally, it has engaged in vertical integration. With this option, a firm loses the gains in specialization. That's the big drawback. That's why ultimately it's the method of last resort. It's like the last option for a firm when they're trying to acquire their inputs to produce. They should only incorporate the production of an input into their own firm when all other options have been dried up, and that would generally happen because of the complications we'll cover in a second. Related to transaction costs, so that's ultimately what it all falls on in terms of determining which option to take. Are there a lot of transaction costs? So transaction costs are costs in excess of the actual amount paid to the input supplier when acquiring an input. Transaction costs may include the cost of searching for a supplier willing to sell a given output. So there's an opportunity cost there with the time that it takes to find the right supplier to get the right input. The cost of negotiating a price at which the input will be purchased. So that also carries with it opportunity costs in terms of time. There's also maybe the need for lawyers to get involved in that situation, which could be expensive as well. Other investments and expenditures required to facilitate the exchange. So sometimes the firm may need to make a special investment just to be able to buy from a particular supplier. So when that happens, you engage in what's called a specialized investment, an investment in a particular exchange that cannot be recovered in another trading relationship. When a firm makes a specialized investment, they engage in what's called a relationship-specific exchange. The resulting relationship between the parties when specialized investments are required to facilitate an exchange. So I'll cover the 4 types of specialized investments. So the first one is site specificity. That occurs when the buyer and the seller of an input must locate their plants close to each other in order to be able to engage in exchange. So electric power plants often locate close to a particular coal mine to minimize the transportation costs of obtaining coal. So it's a lot cheaper to distribute electricity out from the power plant than to pay the coal mine to transport a bunch of coal to some faraway electric plant. So when an electric power plant is built next to a coal mine, the building of that power plant is considered to be a specialized investment. And it falls under the category of site specificity. So the cost of building the two plants close to each other represent the specialized investment that would have little value if the parties were not involved in an exchange. If all of a sudden the relationship soured and that power plant is like out in the middle of nowhere, close to this coal mine, then basically the cost of the power plant has become a sunk cost. It's become a cost that's lost because now they are distributing power over a long distance for no reason, right? The coal is no longer coming from the coal miner. Another specialized investment is known as physical asset specificity. So that refers to a situation where the capital equipment needed to produce an input is designed to meet the needs of a particular buyer and cannot be readily adapted to produce inputs needed by other buyers. So let's say there's like a crane company and they need a very specific type of bolt made. And to make that very specific type of bolt, you need a very specific type of machine that makes that bolt. And that machine will have zero value to make any other kind of bolt, and it will be meaningless in any other kind of transaction between other kind of buyers of your bolts. And so if you invest money in that machine to create that one bolt, then basically you're engaging in a specialized investment. You're creating a relationship-specific exchange between you and the buyer of that bolt, and that amount of investment can be a sunk cost. You could lose it if that relationship dries up. Dedicated assets, another form of specialized investments. So these are general investments made by a firm that allow it to exchange with a particular buyer. So let's say the government is going to be a buyer of computer equipment from HP. And they set up a contract or whatever. Government's a huge customer, so they're going to need a whole new plant, or at least like a whole new division within their production facilities just to service that buyer. That's a specialized investment. If that relationship goes sour, they no longer are selling to the government, they no longer have that kind of demand, then those extra machines, that extra capital equipment will become useless. It will be a sunk cost. And that's why it is considered a specialized investment. And once it's invested, it creates a relationship-specific exchange. Yeah. It's not a partnership. It's just like an arrangement that they make in order for like one company to buy something from the other, right? So like if like I said, like if the government says I'm going to buy a bunch of computers from HP, and HP is like, okay, well now I need to create a whole new factory for that, then I mean that creates a specialized investment for that firm, and they engage in a relationship-specific exchange is what they call it. And then finally, human capital, so technical know-how, knowledge, education, can be considered a specialized investment. Workers must usually learn specific skills to work for a particular firm that may not be transferable to other employers. So if they wind up learning a bunch of stuff that's specific to a particular employer, and then they get fired, that information becomes useless, and so that is a specialized investment as well. Implications of specialized investment for transaction costs. So generally, specialized investments will increase transaction costs in three ways. One is costly bargaining. So if specialized investments are required to obtain the input, then bargaining is going to be required, which can be costly. So to set up those arrangements, to build that one plant, to set up your shop next to the coal mine, to learn the particular tools and the skills you need for a specific type of job, that is all going to require time and effort to set up those arrangements, which again have an opportunity cost and can involve lawyers. Another problem is that of underinvestment. So the firms know that these specialized investments can become sunk costs, and therefore they want to minimize those sunk costs as much as possible. So like you, the bolt manufacturer, might decide, well, I'm not going to get that one machine that I need. I'm going to get a machine that's kind of like the machine I need. But by doing that, then the integrity of that bolt may not be sound, and so you may run into a situation where you get under investment in the specialized investment, which might result in a sour production outcome. So when specialized investments are required to facilitate exchange, the level of specialized investment often is lower than the optimal level. The third problem that again has to do with specialized investments is called the hold-up problem, also known as opportunism. So when a specialized investment must be made to acquire an input, the buyer or seller may attempt to capitalize on the sunk nature of the investment by engaging in opportunism. So suppose the buyer of an input that costs, let's say, $100 has to make a specific investment of, let's say, $10, the cost of verifying the quality of a particular supplier's input. Once she has paid this $10, the supplier then can attempt to say, hold up, I need you to actually pay me $109 now, because I know that you're not going to go elsewhere, because if you go elsewhere, you're going to have to pay $100 for the input, and you're going to lose the $10 that you already spent on me, so it's going to cost you $110 to buy this from somebody else, and therefore I can charge you $109, which is less than what you would be charged, and therefore you're still getting a bargain. So the input supplier would hold up the manager by asking for that price. This is known as the hold-up problem. Once a firm makes a specialized investment, the other party may attempt to rob it of its investment by taking advantage of the investment's sunk nature. I know this is reliant on, people encountering dishonest people in the world, and I know that's a rare thing because everybody's very honest. So it's really silly that I even brought this up. All right. Optimal input procurement. So given the three options, like what's the course for any sort of manager when they're trying to decide what to do as far as how they should acquire their inputs? So they have to consider the economic trade-off. The cost minimizing method of acquiring an input depends on the characteristics of the input. Whether a manager chooses a spot exchange or an alternative method depends on the importance of the specialized investments that lead to the relationship-specific exchange. So then the question is, are there substantial specialized investments relative to contracting costs? Is it better for me as a firm to just pay a law firm to set up a contract, or can I just engage in a spot exchange and just kind of get this done with minimal specialized investments? So when the desired input does not involve specialized investments, the firm can use a spot exchange to obtain the input without concern for opportunism and bargaining costs. When the contracting environment is simple and the cost of running a contract is less than the transaction cost associated with spot exchange, it is optimal to acquire the input through a contract. But then the question is, how long should the contract be? Although a contract often requires substantial upfront expenditures, it offers several advantages. A contract can specify prices of an input before the parties make specialized investments, which avoids the holdup problem. Guaranteeing an acceptable price for both parties for an extended time horizon reduces the incentive for underinvestment. If a contract will be used, the most important question is, how long should the contract last? The optimal contract length reflects the fundamental economic trade-off of marginal cost versus marginal benefit of extending the length of a contract. So we can use that framework to kind of analyze how long a contract should be, or how the length of the contract will be affected by the various trade-offs that the firm is facing as far as the other options. So the marginal cost of extending a contract length, we assume, is increasing as the contract gets longer due to increased hypothetical contingency. So if the contract is longer, then there must be more considered as far as what could happen in the market, what could happen in terms of the relationship between the supplier and the buyer, what could happen in the economy as a whole, etc. Whenever that's the case and you're considering more of these contingencies, that involves more lawyering, more lawyers doing the thing that they do that costs a lot of money. And obviously the extra cost of making a longer contract will increase, and that's what this curve represents. Also, the longer the contract, the greater the likelihood that some other supplier can provide the input at a lower cost in the future. So that also will increase the marginal cost because you'll set up a price and then maybe somebody else can come along later and say, I can provide this to you for cheaper, but you can't get out of the contract. And so that's part of the cost of the contract. But there's a benefit as well. The marginal benefit of extending a contract for another year is the avoided transaction cost of opportunism and bargaining. So by specifying a contract, you're avoiding these other problems that we talked about with respect to transaction costs. And we assume that to just be constant. All right, so the optimal contract length is the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Before that, marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost of a longer contract length, so obviously it makes sense to write a longer one. And when marginal cost exceeds marginal benefit, it doesn't make sense to go further than that. But how is optimal contract length affected by changing conditions? So the optimal contract length will increase when the level of specialized investment required to facilitate an exchange increases. So if it costs more in terms of like these specialized investments, then the marginal benefit, the extra benefit of extending the contract length will increase at any given contract length, and therefore the marginal benefit curve will shift up, which means that the optimal contract length will increase. The optimal contract length also depends on factors that affect the marginal cost of writing longer contracts. How standardized the input may become also will affect it. How complex the contracting environment is as well. So if you have a less complex contracting environment, the marginal cost of any given contract length will be less, which is essentially this curve shifting to the right or down. More standardized inputs, meaning that again, the input that you are looking to buy is more common, is a more common one, and therefore at any given length, the marginal cost will decrease of writing a longer contract length. But if the contract environment is more complex and the input is going to be less standardized, and the marginal cost will increase, and therefore that will decrease the optimal contract length. So just understand like this framework, understand just like the things that will change the optimal contract length. Just the things that I mentioned. So when the product being purchased is extremely complex or the economic environment is plagued with uncertainty, complete contracts will be extremely costly or even impossible to write. By complete contracts, we're talking about contracts that cover all contingencies. So a contract that does not cover all contingencies will necessarily be incomplete. And to get a complete contract, it becomes very expensive. So the next best option is to vertically integrate if that is indeed the case. The firm must, in that case, bear the cost of setting up production facilities for producing a product. The firm no longer specializes in doing what it does best. Because of these difficulties, vertical integration should be viewed as the last resort, undertaken only when spot exchange or contracts have failed. So pretty simple stuff. A lot of it very intuitive, but there's some new language in there that maybe you didn't learn, maybe you didn't know already, but beyond that, not too much complexity in that section. The second part of the chapter deals with the principal agent problem, how to get the interests of those in charge of the firm aligned with those working for the firm. There's two types of versions of that. One is like the principal agent problem, dealing with the principal, which is the owners, and the agent being the manager. How are their incentives aligned? So when ownership is separate from control, the principal agent problem emerges. If the owner is not present to monitor the manager, it is a challenge to get the manager to have the same goals as the owner. The important question from the owner's point of view is how much leisure the manager will consume while on the job, meaning how much will they shirk or avoid responsibility. So if you have some fixed salary for the manager that has nothing to do with the profits of the firm, then the manager has all the incentive to not work at all and shirk for 8 hours, which will lead to zero profits for the firm, but for the manager, obviously their earnings will be the same regardless. So the best option is to set up profit sharing schemes where the wages of the managers are dependent on the profits of the firm. So if you say, well, the managers wages are dependent on how the firm does, and basically the manager gets 10% of the profits, then obviously the manager has a lot of incentive to work the full 8 hours every day, or maybe even just work 7 hours and just make 5,000 less a year or whatever. But regardless, like this will yield a better outcome than if the profits aren't included as part of the wages of the managers, and therefore the principal agent problem can be solved with this kind of approach. It's a pretty simple sort of insight, but it's one that has to be covered. Other things that do discipline managers besides incentive contracts, which is what we just covered. So typically the chief executive officer of a corporation receives stock options and other bonuses directly related to profits. And so that's usually the big solution to the principal agent problem. But there's a couple of other external incentives that do help to solve this problem, one of them being reputation. In the long run, a manager's reputation can be sold at a premium in the market for managers. Good managers are highly valued. They're very rare in this world, and the better they are, obviously, the more they're valued. But if they have a reputation for shirking, not doing their job, and being crappy, then obviously that premium erodes and they become worthless in labor markets. So even when employment contracts do not explicitly include a performance bonus, a manager may choose to do a good job of running the firm simply because of their reputation. And the other external incentive is the threat of a takeover. So if there's a threat of a takeover because the manager's not doing a good job, investors will attempt to buy the firm and replace the management with new managers who will. So that could potentially cause them to be unemployed and then not be able to find work, etc. And then finally, the manager-worker principal agent problem. So again, with individual employees of the firm that are working under managers, you have that same kind of problem where the manager maybe is incentivized by profit-sharing schemes, but maybe employees are not. And so then, what's the best approach there? My insight into this is like treat people with respect. Treat them respectfully, treat them like people, make sure that you are acknowledging that they are human beings and they have lives and that we should value those things. And if you do that, then, they'll work, they'll work hard. But obviously there's other methods of approaching this on large scale when, you can't get personal with folks. One is to do the profit sharing thing. One mechanism the manager can use is to enhance a worker's efforts is profit sharing, making the worker's compensation dependent on the underlying profitability of the firm. Or they can be revenue sharing rather than profit sharing, linking compensation to the underlying revenues of the firm, such as like tips and sales commissions. Revenue sharing is most effective when worker productivity is related to revenues rather than costs. So like you think about a retail security guard, their job is more closely connected to the cost of the firm rather than their revenues. So it may not work too well with a security guard. But there are problems with revenue sharing. It does not provide incentive for workers to minimize costs. A food server may attempt to collect a big tip by offering the customer large portions, free drinks, etc. So, there could be issues there with that approach. Another approach is piece rates, where the compensation is dependent on the production of the employee. And under that kind of situation, generally you won't have employees. They'll be independent contractors, and they'll be producing, however much they can. But a potential problem with this is that there has to be a lot of effort expended in quality control because, people will put in an effort to produce, but maybe not the quality that the firm expects. So lower quality reduces sales, thus reducing compensation to those receiving revenue or profit-sharing incentives. And finally, time clocks and spot checks. So time clocks aren't really a great way of sort of solving the principal agent problem because they're just a way of tracking whether people are at work or not. The advantage of spot checks, which is like random checks of the workplace, so that workers expect to be checked on, but they don't know when they're going to be checked upon. So an advantage of that is that they reduce the cost of monitoring employees. Managers don't have to be available all the time. They just simply the threat of them being available is enough to kind of solve the principal agent problem. So to be effective, spot checks need to be random. A disadvantage of spot checks is that they must occur frequently enough to induce workers not to risk getting caught shirking, and they must entail some penalty for workers caught shirking. Pretty intuitive stuff, not too complicated. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 6. So chapter 6, not much there as far as like theory and like substance, but a lot of really practical insights. So you could use this information to kind of help at least maybe talk about some of the issues related to your firms that you're talking about in your papers. Anyway, let's take a break. Let's come back at 8:35.